All right. Well, we may kick into things. Kia ora koutou, ko Jackson Tukawingoa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jackson. I am the director of the Aotearoa New Zealand Stewardship Code, and welcome to the final Stewardship Masterclass for 2024. This one focused on voting. Just as some housekeeping as we get started for this webinar, I want to note that the first half of this webinar will be being recorded so that we can share that publicly following the meeting. The second half, which is a signatory-only Q&A, we will transition to Chatham House rules, and I'll note that at the time that it'll be transitioning to Chatham House, and that portion of the call won't be shared publicly. So just so you know, we very much encourage questions, and please use the chat function during the first half to lodge your questions, and then during the second half we will transition to that Q&A section and allow you to come off mute and speak to the panelists directly also. So this is about voting. Now, what is voting and why bother? You know, is voting really complex enough to need a masterclass like we're doing today? Well, I think the answer is increasingly yes. Principle 5 of the Stewardship Code encourages signatories to vote responsibly, is the title of the principle, which means to exercise voting rights in accordance with their investment mandate and to regularly and transparently disclose voting actions and outcomes. But when many of you as investors hold thousands of stocks, considering each vote can be a time-consuming process. We're also seeing growing scrutiny internationally on the differences between how asset managers and owners vote. And then there's the pretty fundamental question of what are the outcomes of voting? Does voting actually make a difference? Not to mention the companies sitting in the midst of all this, attempting to navigate the varying outcomes and votes and opinions from investors and deliver the best possible outcomes for their shareholders. So I do think it's getting increasingly complex, and because of that, I'm very pleased to introduce a panel of industry leaders from around the world today to share their expertise as we discuss these trends and their implications for both investors, companies, and directors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So on the panel today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Aeisha Mastagni, Portfolio Manager of Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies from the California State Teachers Retirement System, or CalSTRS, as you may be familiar with them, the largest education-only pension fund in the world. Also got Jorge Waayman, Manager of the ESG Research at Harbour Asset Management, a New Zealand-based asset manager and Stewardship Code signatory. Mander, CEO of the New Zealand Shareholders Association. And Philip Fu, VP APAC Research and Engagement at Glass Lewis, a global proxy advisory service. Now, to start this masterclass, I've asked Philip to share a brief summary of some of the voting trends from across New Zealand from the most recent proxy season, so we can get a general sense of the activity that's happening down here currently. So with that, thank you, Philip. I will pass over to you to give a summary.
Thank you very much, Jackson, and good morning to everyone on the call today. Today, I'm going to be giving the earliest and shortest season review I've ever given, as you'll be aware that the NZX season is ongoing, but we can already see a few trends emerging, and we can already get a few takeaways as to what shareholders are particularly interested in when they're voting on NZX stocks. So what I've gone and done is gathered the vote result data for all NZX listed companies that are A, within the NZX 50, and B, have a market cap of at least $1 billion. And the cutoff point for this was last Thursday, so we're missing a few given that the season's still ongoing. And we can get a few takeaways from this so far. If you have a look at the bottom left corner of the slide here, I've sorted the proposals into 5 categories. And that gives you a real sense on what New Zealand shareholders get to vote on. By and large, it's around the election of directors, and we can see some interesting vote results there, given that there's some directors are quite well supported, others showing signs of a little bit of pressure from shareholders. Auditor-related proposals, that's fairly technical and standard in the New Zealand environment. Executive remuneration proposals are increasingly common. Now, that a few years ago, that number would have been 0, 1, or 2. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is that a number of companies in New Zealand have been pressured by some Australian investors, usually the superannuation funds, into holding executive remuneration votes, just as is required under Australian company law. So there's a little bit of an import of market practice here, given that some of the Australian super funds are large shareholders of NZX listed companies. But I've recently heard some interesting comments and interesting thoughts on the New Zealand side of the fence, where that might not necessarily be as welcome as the Australian super funds seeking to make that import is. I think Oliver may have some comments on that a little bit later in the session. I'd probably wrap up on this slide before we go into protest votes with one other comment. In this large cap space, we have not seen any ESG shareholder proposals. We've not seen significant contested activism, contested elections. We do see a little bit more of that as we drop into the mid cap space, but for all intents and purposes, the 2024 NZX season was relatively free of that, those more exotic proposals. Now, the key thing, the most important votes really are the ones where the board did not receive overwhelming support, because by and large, AGM resolutions are well supported. But just to give you a sense on what New Zealand companies have received from some of these less supported resolutions. At the top, there was a retirement payment to a long-serving NED, non-executive director, of 120,000 that received a significant against vote. Now that's pretty typical, because it is quite hard to justify what's in it for shareholders when you're giving someone who's leaving the company a thank you payment rather than a nice dinner voucher out there receiving $120,000. So that was a protest. Beyond that, you can see there's a range of items, and look, this is what I've expected the reasons to be. It is an estimate. There are NED fee increases, either where there's a second year in a row of a NED fee increase, or the non-executive directors have received particularly large increases. Occasionally that results in a protest vote. There are matters of directors being overboarded. There's matters of directors being particularly long tenure, which has independence issues, which often result in against recommendations. Those are fairly typical, I guess, protest reasons. But some of the more exotic there are a couple cases of company underperformance trickling into support for directors. Fletcher Building at number 3, Kathy Quinn being one prime example, 22.7% against her re-election, following Fletcher Building being an underperforming stock. Finally, I'll just make one last comment before we wrap this up, because this might pop up later in the session. If you look at number 9 at Sky City Entertainment, there was a small but notable 12% opposition to the re-election of Chad Barton. Chad Barton is the former CFO of Star Entertainment, another casino operator in Australia. Star Entertainment is having massive regulatory issues and is at constant ongoing threat of losing its license. It's one of the worst performing companies on the ASX. And what this is showing is a little bit of a trend towards some degree of issue following directors from one company where they may have served as an executive or a director to other companies. So, Jackson, I might leave it at that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for that kind of overview and the scoop, I think we can call it, given it's still so early in the proxy season. We appreciate that early summary, and some of the anecdotal insights you shared as well around the likes of exec remuneration votes being far less common in New Zealand even only a few years ago, and seeing some trends like that start to change. And I'm sure we'll cover more of that. To the director point you just ended on, I've heard many similar comments around Qantas recently in Australia, with the issues that Qantas faced in recent years following those directors who have since left that company. So that's certainly something to be conscious of. Philip, I might just stick with you following that introduction to just have I guess, get a bit of a sense of you particularly for those on the call who may be less familiar with proxy voting. Can you just briefly break down how it works, and what is the point of voting? And to my question in the opening, can voting really make a difference?
Sure. Look, I mean, what do we mean when we're talking about proxy voting? Well, shareholders essentially have two main formal ways of applying pressure on a company. The first is buying or selling shares, right? The second starts to be more aligned around exercising your ownership rights. And a lot of that is falling under proxy voting. Now, of course, you can go ahead and engage lawyers to pressure a company. You can file shareholder resolutions and put up your own directors, but those are, look, I'd think in 99.9% of cases, shareholders are not going to be doing that. So really that voting mechanism is the formal quantifiable way for shareholders to try and influence a company. Now, coming out of that, because you have such a right, you're also going to find that you've got informal avenues for engagement with the company where you can start to talk to the company around, what kind of behaviors you want to see out of them. All of this is to the point that you're trying to use your voting rights, which enable engagement, to protect your economic value of your investment and encourage behaviors of the issuer and out of the board that you want to see. Look, I think it's incredibly impactful. I think if you didn't have proxy voting rights, investors would not be getting callbacks from the companies and from the boards unless they were really threatening to pull capital, right? And I think very few shareholders are probably in the position where they can really get callbacks on that, given capital markets are so global and there's so many different sources of capital, at least in the large cap area. So look, ultimately, I do think it needs to be taken fairly seriously, and it needs to be taken as an escalation point for your engagement program.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Philip. And I think those are great points, particularly around protecting economic value. And then the escalation point, I'm sure we'll come to further on in this webinar as well. George, with that kind of introduction to proxy voting and how it works, can you kind of paint us that more practical picture for Harbour, and how does proxy voting work within Harbour?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jackson, and kia ora, everyone. So I think in general, at a practical level, you can approach voting in different ways. So, for example, you can choose to just vote on material resolutions or completely outsource to a service provider. For us at Harbour, we choose to vote on all of the proposals for companies that we invest in, regardless if these are just administrative or non-controversial in nature. And they cover both annual shareholder meetings as well as any extraordinary meetings that come up as well. And we do use a proxy service provider to help with providing the research and to facilitate the operational execution of the voting process itself. But ultimately, we do make all of the final decisions in-house on how we'd vote and may override the recommendations made by our proxy advisor. But in practice, most of the time, there is agreement on how we vote in line with the recommendations of our proxy advisor. But there may be instances where we engage with companies as well and form a different view. But in terms of how we come to some of these voting decisions, we do have some guiding principles that we generally follow, but as a caveat, each resolution obviously is assessed on a case-by-case basis, and there may be circumstances where we'd deviate from those. So I'll just touch on a few example principles, but you can read the full list in our stewardship policy available on our website. So firstly, starting off with board composition, we believe that boards should comprise a majority of independent directors, subject to them contributing the valuable skills and experience with an adequate level of diversity as well. And then we think the roles of CEO and chairperson should generally be separate, with board subcommittees also being majority represented by independent directors. And then when it comes to executive remuneration, we believe that companies should report sufficient information on those structures. So, for example, including details on their vesting schedules and performance hurdles on their incentive schemes. And then we think that a company's equity-based compensation plans should be in alignment with shareholders' long-term interests. And there should also be a direct link between bonus outcomes and the performance of the company. And then the last one, just around director remuneration. We think that this should be benchmarked to an appropriate peer set that covers considerations such as the company's geography, the industry, and complexity and size of the business. And then in terms of the actual process, how we go about voting, so it does start with me collating all of the relevant research, and sending it through to the corresponding Harbour analyst that covers the company in question, who then reviews the resolutions and provides those voting instructions across the accounts that own the security. Then in determining how to vote, they'll consider those guiding principles I just went through, the research recommendations from our proxy advisor, and then also just the in-depth knowledge that they have on the company. And in some cases, like I mentioned, we might engage with management or the board to get further clarity ahead of the decision as well. And then once we've decided on how we're going to vote, we submit those into the online execution platform, and then record the voting decisions in both soft and hard copies, noting any rationales for where we might be voting against management or going against the recommendations of our proxy advisor. And then finally, just a point around accountability. We do review our policy where it comes to voting and stewardship generally, more annually or more frequently if required. And we do supplement these with a few different accountability measures, such as an annual controls audit, which covers proxy voting. And then some of our funds are also certified under the REA program that includes a stewardship component as well. And then also it forms an input into our risk committee meetings, running through all of the contentious votes that have come up throughout the period. So yeah, at a high level, I think that's kind of how we approach things, but obviously every manager is going to be a bit different in how they kind of apply this in practice.
Great. Thank you very much for that overview, George. One of the points that stood out to me is the review piece that you touched on at the end, because I think it's one thing to create a great process as you have done, but then it's also another to continually and actively review that and make sure it's effective year on year and see how it can be improved year on year. Aotearoa, I want to bring you in here, and again, thinking about George's process, if we then translate that to the world's largest education-only pension fund, I can't imagine the amount of work you and your colleagues have to do through proxy season and the likes. I want to kind of, it'd be great to hear how your process has evolved over the years. What's kind of changed and evolved with your proxy voting process?
Yes, thanks, Jackson. Thanks for having me, and hello to everyone. No, you're absolutely right. So every year we vote over 10,000 proxies. We feel like we know it's our fiduciary responsibility to vote those proxies in the best interest of the teachers of California. And, we manage all of our proxy voting activities like any other plan asset with the same due diligence and care. Very similar to what George was saying, we do have a set of corporate governance principles that guide all of our proxy voting activities, and those are approved by our board. It's an evolving process. We review those every year. Sometimes we need to make significant changes or update it with best practices that are occurring. But so we periodically update those when necessary. I think that, thank you, Philip, for providing some of those statistics. I think that one of the things that helps us manage our process is the proxy advisory services. And I know sometimes, well, here in the US, they've been under attack in the past. And, I think that one of the value propositions that they offer, which is undervalued in the marketplace, is really just the logistics of voting proxies. And really what the advisors help us do is really kind of triage our proxy voting activity. Routine issues are voted in alignment with our principles, whereas some of the more contentious or high profile votes, that's where I have people on my team that are really taking a deep dive into those issues and the analysis there. And Jackson, back to your point about, what's really changed. I'll just say that I tell all the people on my team that, man, I had it easy starting out in this business, 20 years ago. I think for the folks that are voting proxies now, one, the issues are just so much more complicated than they used to be. When I started, it was very much black and white. Did you have a poison pill? Did you not? Were you an independent director? Were you not? Now these issues are so much more complex. And then the sheer volume, we didn't always have say on pay or remuneration votes on the proxy. The sheer volume of shareholder proposals that we're seeing and the complexity of those proposals, I just think that you need to start now setting up those processes because, like I said, I don't see it getting any less complicated going forward.
Thank you, Aisha. Completely agree. And particularly, you're mentioning shareholder proposals, or actually, as Philip called them, I think the exotic proposals. I liked that term earlier, Philip. I'm going to come back to you on that question because I'm fascinated about that landscape in the US and what that means in a country like New Zealand, which thus far doesn't have many ERS-related shareholder proposals. Before I do, Oliver, I want to bring you in. And, I think one of the things I note with the Shareholders Association in New Zealand is the depth of relationships you have with some of New Zealand's leading companies in the NZX. And I, recognise that it's easy for us as investors to say, let's vote against that or for that, etc. But it's a whole nother perspective to think about, well, actually, what does this mean for the company? And if we're going to disagree with them, how do we do that when it's, can be a sensitive thing and there's relationships to maintain and work to be done on all sides? So, how, in your experience, how do companies typically respond to these voting processes that we're hearing about? And what should investors be thinking about to manage their relationships when, sometimes you're disagreeing with what a company would like to do?
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Jackson. I guess the first thing I would say, and NZSA has really sort of worked hard in the last few years to ensure that we can be that independent, honest broker in the room. So that objectivity and that evidence base, that really forms the core of forming those good relationships. So it means that we don't always side with every shareholder proposal that comes forward. It doesn't mean we're always siding with the company either. And actually, though, what you can rely on is a certain degree of integrity in the assessments that we undertake. So a bit like Jorge has described, and Philip as well, we do have a set of best practice policies. There's about 20 of them, and they cover a range of topics, the remuneration issues, director fees, exec rem, director rem, board composition, director tenure, takeovers, audit, a whole bunch of sort of relevant areas for consideration when we're looking at governance. We will always have a conversation with the company as part of that process. So in assessing, once notice meeting comes out, we will always have a company. We're not always welcome, but 95% of the time we are indeed welcomed. Because I think companies and issuers generally, they see our feedback as constructive, and that's driven off the back of that independent base that we have. So what we see over time is a fairly significant improvement in what we would term, we do term it our governance quality index. And that's driven by the NZSA policies. We can obviously quantify that behind the scenes. We've worked hard to make sure that our policies are measurable, that they are essentially smart objectives, and we can assess individual companies against that. Now, of course, there's always nuance. There's always trade-offs around what a company will do in its particular given context, and we also work hard to understand that context. So that does influence how we vote. So we can do an objective assessment, and then we're looking at a subjective interpretation based on the evidence and the context available. But generally, that objective assessment, that forms a significant part of how we think about the quality of a company's governance and its transparency, its disclosures. So we will use that to inform our voting in the first instance, but it will always drive a conversation with the company up front. So this calendar year, we have met as of yesterday. We've voted with 123 shareholder meetings. So that's full coverage of the NZX plus a couple of USXs and a couple of ASXs as well. That proxy service is available to anyone to use, obviously, we are in the process of attempting to form deeper relationships with the likes of yourselves, with institutions, wealth managers, so we can actually have a more constructive conversation with your firms in terms of actually how we can work together to continue to work for the good of good corporate governance in New Zealand. So, but yeah, what we've seen over time is a trend of improvement. And when we started this process in 2021, our governance quality index was sitting at about 60%. So that means that companies overall, they were meeting about 60% of sort of our policy points, if you will. Now that percentage is at 72. That's taken a big, we tightened some of our standards last year, so it actually dipped in 2023. And this year, though, it has gone up markedly. And a big part of that has been our work around CEO remuneration reporting. So we know Australia has the stick through their legal framework. We don't think that's a particularly effective way to actually improve remuneration disclosures in an underlying sense. I mean, yes, you've got to do a report. That report can say what it likes. And if you look at Santana Minerals, who are listed here on the NZX, as well as, of course, having a primary listing in Australia, that's probably a mid-cap or small cap in Australia, I'm not quite sure. But that company's remuneration report has got some pretty, weak disclosures. So certainly that doesn't match up against the standards that we have here in New Zealand and what we promote in terms of those disclosure requirements. So what we have done is we worked very hard through the Corporate Governance Institute of the NZX. We created a remuneration reporting template, and that was made public by the NZX in December 2023. That has underpinned a significant improvement in New Zealand's remuneration reporting this year. So we've worked to encourage companies to adopt that framework, to actually adopt the very practical templates that framework contains and the disclosure tables that it has. And look, that's probably underpinned a significant improvement in how remuneration reporting is now occurring in NZ over the last 12 months. It was woeful. I'm not trying to defend what NZ issuers were doing when it came to remuneration reporting. I can see George nodding, so I suspect he's probably in agreement with that. But certainly this year we've seen a significant improvement. We're very pleased with that, and we hope that it continues. But yeah, so look, companies do respond to what we say, and they do respond, of course, to what others in the industry are saying also. Some things don't actually make it to a vote. So if we look at earlier this year, we had the case where Vector put forward Bruce Hassel as an independent director for election. He was appointed just after the last shareholder meeting. Ultimately, that resolution was pulled from consideration. Back in late 23, we saw Fletcher Building put up what we would term a significant director fee increase. That never made it to the shareholder meeting either. And that was really on the back of a lot of feedback they received from the likes of ourselves and I suspect others as well. So that often is how, and when it comes to activism, I would term it constructive activism. It's actually trying to work for the good of shareholders, but also ensuring that you are still founding that with independent assessment of really strong corporate governance principles and practices. So,
right.
Yep. So I guess I just want to finish off quickly in terms of specific examples where, and I think Philip touched on the fact that there was sort of no major sort of activism issues in 2024. That is probably in a broad way that is probably correct. I can think of examples though where there have been some specific concerns raised by shareholders, and we have taken a position on those. And one notable one early in the year was PGG Wrightson, where the major shareholder decided he wanted to remove the rest of the independent directors from that board. We objected to that. We wrote to every shareholder. had that gone to a vote, I don't think it would have been quite as clear-cut as possibly the major shareholder would have thought, and the resolution in the end was withdrawn. So again, that's working behind the scenes, up front, before issues actually become issues, and that's really how we try to operate in terms of our relationships with companies.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Oliver. I think that reflects some changing investor practice broadly across the market, where investors are increasingly having these constructive, hopefully, conversations, and companies are becoming more familiar with that as stewardship practices more generally across New Zealand are growing. I'm going to ask one more question to Aeisha before we then transition to the signatory-only Q&A. So please invite signatories to share any questions you have in the chat, or get your hand up if you want to be first in the queue. Aeisha, to finally, for this public section of the webinar, you touched on these shareholder resolutions, and maybe some of them could be quite exotic. We hear a lot about these environmentally and socially focused ones in the US in particular, but there has been much less in New Zealand. Typically, my understanding is that the resolutions in the US often don't get enough votes to pass necessarily, but I'm sure they still have some sort of influence on the company and can be part of a broader strategy. So it'd be great to hear how CalSTRS uses shareholders resolution as part of a broader strategy.
Yes, thanks, Jackson. So we do sometimes submit shareholder resolutions to companies. We generally use it as more of an escalation tool. Depends on if the company's been responsive, or we've already voted against directors, or maybe there's been other shareholder resolutions that have garnered significant support. So we typically will use shareholder resolutions. I think that right now, for CalSTRS, when we submit a resolution, we really want it to pass. We really want to get to that 50% mark. I'm not sure that everyone feels the same way in the United States. There's significantly more resolutions out there. I think that there's a lot of resolutions in terms of, we call them the anti-ESG resolutions. So that's creating a lot of noise. Right now, what's becoming more challenging is, 10, 15 years ago, there might have been one resolution on the ballot that asked a company about environmental risk disclosures or risks related to climate. Now it's not uncommon, especially at very large companies, to see 3 or 4 resolutions about the same issue. They're all worded slightly different and sometimes ask for different things, but that's complicated our voting. Just because I think for us, we spend so much time trying to determine, okay, what is this resolution asking? Is it material to us as investors? And is it something that the company can actually implement, or is it something that they're not doing? And so we typically try to find that one resolution that most aligns with our principles and what we're seeking as investors. And so sometimes I think that's distorted some of the support or lack of support for some of these resolutions out there. And in a lot of cases, I wish we could all coordinate a little bit better in the US, but that's a challenge too.
I'd be considering, again, the volume of resolutions that you're dealing with and the different laws and things around the place. So I can understand that it's challenging. Thank you very much to the panelists. Don't go anywhere, but I just want to thank those who have watched the first half of this webinar online. And we'll now transition to the signatory, stewardship code signatory only Q&A and Chatham House rules from here.